Hey, Pastor Tim here. Going to give it a few minutes as we wait. It is Wednesday night, 6 o'clock. And I know some of you watch this a little bit later. Oh, look, Jan's on that. Oh, you know what that means? It's time to start. Hi, Jan. But we'll wait for a few more people because it's Wednesday night. And it always takes us a little while. And I always do these things right after I eat. I should not do that. Hey, while we're waiting for people to join us, let me do what I normally do. I'm going to stall a little bit and tell you what's coming up this week. Tomorrow, we've got Tony and Lisa will be bringing us some music as they always do on Thursday night. Friday, Pastor Kathleen and her family will be joining us as they always do for Faith 5 at 6 o'clock right here on this Facebook channel. And then Saturday is our weekly worship service. So we go, we do an online service, 5 o'clock on Facebook and on YouTube. And then it's available for you whenever you want to watch it. So this weekend, as we wrap up Black History Month in our worship services, we're going to look at the story of Simon of Cyrene. And he carried the cross of Jesus. So we're going to look at what it means to be followers of Jesus who take up the cross and follow Jesus. And so that will be our theme as we continue our look at the cross stories of Jesus. And so we've got great worship. And if you've been watching lately, you know the music has been outstanding. It will be again this weekend as well. So that's what's coming up here in the next few days as we move through the week. And so glad to have you with us. This is Wednesday night. And on Wednesday nights, we do a Bible study of some sort or a study of some sort. And I thought what I would do tonight is, as we're waiting for people to join us, to step back a little bit, do a little longer introduction, and then we will get into the topic for today. Sorry. So last year when we started this, we were doing Monday through Friday, 6 o'clock prayer time, and Wednesday nights, we started doing Bible study. And the Bible studies normally were a deeper look at the sermon from the previous weekend. As we were getting to the end of the year, and we took a little break over the Christmas season, did some other things, I started thinking about what can we do starting in January that will keep this thing fresh and that will be helpful for us. And because I happen to be a person who loves to learn, I love to read, I love to learn new things. It's thrilling for me when, after being a pastor for almost 40 years, to read a book where I just see things differently, or I read a book and I see life differently. I love books that challenge my thinking. I love to think creatively, and I love to share the new things I'm learning. So I was thinking about that, and then as the Christmas season wore on, and we were making our way through a volatile political season, I was increasingly troubled by what I was seeing coming out of the Christian church, the Big C church. The number of Christians who were falling prey to conspiracy theories and lies. The numbers of Christians who were saying things about God, about the Bible, that weren't thought through at all, and actually just downright bad theology. And I sort of brought these two things together and thought, let's do something called a Thinking Person's Guide to Faith. We all do thinking about a lot of different things, but sometimes we don't do the kind of thinking we should when it comes to our faith and how to live our faith out. And so originally my idea was, well, we'll do some of the tough topics in the Bible, and we will. And so on January 6th, our first Wednesday, we were going to look at why is God so vindictive in the Old Testament? And of course, as you remember now, January 6th was the Capitol riots. And so we didn't do much that night. I think we were all speechless. I was speechless. I was angry. I was shocked like you were. And so we just spent some time in prayer. And then the next week, I followed it up with a Thinking Person's Guide to dealing with the Capitol riots and how do we as Christians respond to the political divisions we've been seeing, the conspiracy theories we've been seeing. And it struck me that yeah, one of the things we need to wrestle with as Christians is how our faith and our lives impact each other. And so then we did one on screen time, because screen time, in particular social media, has been such a profound shaper of the way we view life, and how to pull back from that and let the Word of God shape our lives. We did a town hall meeting where we talked about the future of the church a little bit. And then the last 2 weeks we did a little prayer service for COVID, and then we did Ash Wednesday last week. What I want to do tonight with you brave folks who are joining us, is dive into a topic that's been hanging around us now for a long, long time, but it came back in full force back last year in around May, when George Floyd was killed, and we all saw that horrific thing take place on TV over and over again. And the Black Lives Matter movement and people heading out into the streets for mostly peaceful protests to say, look, this has got to stop. And for whatever reason, for me, that was a wake-up call for me. And I wanted to know why this is going on. And this is where you'll see some of my own ignorance. How is it that we can have an African-American president for 8 years, and then just a year or two later, we have this happening with George Floyd and others? And so I decided to start interviewing people, particularly African-American friends of mine, to just get their perspective. I didn't come with an agenda. I just wanted to learn. I had questions to ask. And during one of the interviews, I was talking to a Grace family, Carlotta Turman and her mom, Frances, African-Americans. Carlotta is on our church board now. And her mom, Frances, is an older woman. That doesn't mean anything bad. She's just an older woman who's lived a lot, lived through the civil rights movement, Jim Crow. And as we were talking about her life experiences and Carlotta's as well, Frances said something really fascinating to me. She said, Black history is American history. Black history is American history. And I never thought about that before. And I was challenged by that. I was intrigued by that. And I wanted to learn. And so I can honestly say that since that day, back in, maybe it was June, every day with the exception of a couple, I have done something every day to learn about the issue of race in the United States of America, both as an American citizen and as a Christian person. I've watched movies, documentaries, I've read books, I've talked to people. Many of those interviews are online on our Facebook page. I just had a hunger to know what's going on, and particularly as a Christian person, what is my call? What is my responsibility? What is our responsibility as a church to speak into issues like this? Now, I recognize that there are many facets to racism. I just finished a book called Jews Don't Count, written by a Jewish man in England, could have been written here. And his whole point is that anti-Semitism is happening all around the world, but we don't talk about it much. I saw a piece the other day that said that hate crimes against our Asian brothers and sisters has gone way up, especially after the previous administration kept calling the pandemic the China virus. And so these are all issues that work together, but in our country, we have this particular issue with our Black American brothers and sisters. And what I want to do today is begin to talk about that from a gospel perspective. I'm not here with a bunch of answers. This is just to help us start thinking about these kinds of things. Now, I realize that when we talk about race, it is very difficult for us to keep the discussions in the front part of our brain, which is the thinking part of our brains. We almost always immediately go to the back part of the brain, the emotive part of the brain, the fight or flight part of the brain, and we get, depending on our perspective, we get defensive or we get angry. Maybe there's trauma we've experienced, there's disagreement. Your church is talking politics when you should just talk the Bible. It's very hard for us to just step back, take a breath, and look at what's going on in the world, especially as Christian people, and learn. And I want to suggest that we at Community Grace are brave enough to try to do that. And And that's what we're going to start to do tonight and then next week. I think what's important to understand is that race and racism is not a human issue, is not a political issue, first and foremost, though there are political repercussions to it and sometimes political answers to it and political challenges that cause it. But racism is a human problem. And as we're going to see, it's a gospel issue rooted in an abusive understanding of the gospel, as we'll talk about tonight. But it's a gospel issue. And it's a gospel issue because we as Christians believe that all of us, regardless of our ethnicity, the color of our skin, we were all created in the image of God. And what that tells us in part is that the image of God is creative and varied. And anytime any one group of people looks down on another group of people with disdain, and whatever forms that takes, that is a dehumanizing of the image of God and an invalidation or devaluation of God the Creator. And what happens is, and Martin Luther King was very good at saying this, when one group lords it over another, sees itself as superior to another, sees another group as inferior, it dehumanizes the power group as well. When I dehumanize someone else, it dehumanizes me. And that's why it's such an important issue for all of us. James Baldwin, the black writer from the 1960s, said this: "Whoever debases others is debasing himself." So for me, the best way to try to get from here back up into the front part of my brain is to look at history. History can be challenging, it can be eye-opening, it can be thought-provoking, but history is history, right? It certainly talks to our emotions, but it doesn't have an emotional agenda to it. It's just history. And then we can mine truths, we can mine grace, we can mine insights out of that history. I'm going to put on my thinking person's glasses. There, I look smart, don't I? It's not helping. Here's what James Baldwin says about history. I love this quote. "For history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." So the history we're going to look at, the history of Christianity and race, is still a part of us, as we'll talk about, and we'll tease that out more next week. So as I was doing my study and reading not only history, but Christian history and African-American authors and pastors, I saw a storyline to Christianity, the Christianity that I have been raised in, that I did not know about before. And it's important for me, it's important for us to know it so that we can be aware of it. And when it is leading us to make assumptions about the value of other people, we need to be able to see it and say, no, that's not what Christianity is all about. And that's why I want to focus on the history of Christianity in our country and the issue of race. So let me give you just a little bit of interesting context. Let me take a sip of water. The last known person born into slavery in our country is a man by the name of Sylvester Maggie or McGee. He died in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 1971. A man who lived in slavery, who was enslaved in this country, died in 1971. I was in junior high then. I was alive at the time that former slaves were alive. Ruth Odom Bonner, a child of former slaves, so her parents were slaves. stood alongside President Obama and rang the bell opening the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016. She was 99 years old. So the child of former slaves, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, stood next to President Barack Obama. We were alive then. I was born near the end of Jim Crow. I was alive during the civil rights riots. I was alive when African Americans didn't have the right to vote. This is not ancient history. This is living history. This is stuff that was happening in our lifetime. And that's why it's so important for us to talk about it and to deal with it. Now, it'd be easy for me. I'm a part of a white congregation. We can pretty much ignore it because it doesn't really affect us. But I don't think that's what Jesus really allows us to do. Because if someone's affected, if our neighbor's affected, then we're affected. So let me just read a couple quotes for you, and then I'm going to dive into what we're talking about. All of this is just to get us ready for what I'm going to talk about. James Baldwin, once again. Love takes off the masks we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Love takes off the masks we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. We're taking our masks off tonight. And then I read this quote when I did my talk on the Capitol riots from Rabbi Joachim Prinz, a refugee from Germany. When I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, the most important thing I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent and disgraceful, the most shameful, the most tragic problem is silence. And we Lutherans, unfortunately, our German Lutheran friends, had that problem back under Nazism. And again, we're called to love our neighbor, so we can't be silent. So we're going to have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to just take you through a quick little history lesson, and then we'll tease it out more next week. I do want to say a couple things. I am not savvy enough while I'm talking to you to read your comments. So if you have questions or comments you want to make, please feel free to do that. And then I'll try to respond to them either to you on Facebook or next week. If you have a question that you want to ask me that you don't want to put for everyone to see, you can either message me in Facebook or tim@boldrecklessgrace.org, tim@boldrecklessgrace.org. And then you can send your questions to me. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll dive in. So God, as we talk about this important topic, I pray that you would give us the eyes to see and the ears to hear what you would have us see and hear today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, you ready? Deep breath. So Martin Luther King Jr. once made this comment. He said many, many years ago that the most segregated hour of the week in the United States of America is 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. Now, it could be 9, it could be 10. His point is this, that every Sunday morning, for the most part, white people go to their churches, black people go to their churches. It is the most segregated hour in the United States of America, and it is still true today, some 60 years later. Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 through 10 paints this picture of God's preferred vision for life. After this, John wrote, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all the tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. And so God's vision of worship is diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multicolored, multi-generational, all of us worshiping together the same God in the same place, with all of our uniquenesses. But as Martin Luther King observes, we are a long ways away from that vision. And there are a lot of reasons for it. Nothing is always as simple as just one answer. But the big reason for it is the one we're going to talk about these next couple weeks. And to do that, we need grace, We need to speak truth, and we then need the courage to say, God, how do you want me to respond? So the question is, how do we get here? If God's vision for worship is multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multicolored, diverse, how do we get to this segregated worship experience? And what's going on? And there's a long history to that. So what I want to do is quickly share with you some stories, and then share with you some stories about why those stories happened. And that will make sense to you as we go along. All right? And some of these I'm going to just read for you. In the late 1700s in Philadelphia, a black man walked into a church to pray. What he didn't realize was that he was kneeling in the whites-only section of the church, and incensed by his audacity, he was thrown out of the church onto the streets of Philadelphia. The African Americans in that community and that church were so incensed at this act of dehumanization and this dehumanizing Christianity, they left the church and started what would become the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. Many of you would know it as the AME. The point, or at least one of the points, the black church was birthed out of the rejection of black people by the white church. The black church was birthed out of the rejection of black people by the white church. Now, I'm not saying all white people were racist, all white Christians were racist at that time. What I'm saying is that white Christianity at that time, for the most part, was not all that keen on having black people worship with them. George Whitefield was the Billy Graham of his day, of the 18th century. He preached to millions of people, both in the United States of America and the United Kingdom. And this is in a day, of course, without TV or internet, anything. He went from place to place. Millions of people. His crowds got to be so large that they couldn't meet in buildings anymore. They met out in the open air. And this man is credited with leading hundreds of thousands of people into a relationship with Jesus. One of the great evangelists of his day. And yet, he owned slaves. And he not only owned slaves, but he used his influence as a Christian leader to convince Georgia to make it legal to own black people. So part of what our history tells us is that there were influential white Christian leaders who were at the forefront of dehumanizing black people, using their influence as Christian leaders to enslave black people. And so part of what this says is it's not a racism problem, it was a gospel problem. And when the gospel only focuses on personal salvation rather than on God's desire for equality and justice, we quickly fall into those traps. November 25th, 1844. Reverend Basil Manley Sr., the president of the University of Alabama, a former pastor of the prominent First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina, along with a group of Alabama Baptists, sent a letter to the triannual meeting of the Baptists arguing for including slaveholders to be leaders in the mission of the Baptist movement. Our duty at this crisis requires us to demand from the proper authorities the distinct, explicit avowal that slaveholders are eligible and entitled equally with non-slaveholders to all the privileges and immunities of their several unions. When they received an uncompromising no, when they said no, slave owners cannot be church leaders, slave owners will not be appointed to positions as missionaries, Manley and his group formed a new denomination called the Southern Baptist Convention, built on the assumption that slavery could flourish alongside the gospel. So the Southern Baptist Convention was birthed out of the belief that slavery is biblical. Now, they're trying to come to terms with that, right? Again, we're just setting a story here for how Christianity, white Christianity, paved the way for slavery and racism. And one final story, and then I'll tell you some stories about why these stories happen. In 1900, The American Book and Bible House published a book by Charles Carroll called The Negro Beast, or In the Image of God, ? Now there's some rough language coming up here, but I'm going to read it as it is. His thesis was that white people descended from Adam and Eve, but that Negroes originally descended from animals. If the white was created in the image of God, he wrote, then the Negro was made after some other model, and at a glance, the Negro indicates the model. His very appearance suggests the ape. This is a Christian man now. His book being published by Christian people, a Bible society. He goes on to suggest that black people were simply animals that had the capability of speech and had been designed by God to serve the white man. The publisher backed the book by saying that if any error could be found in that book, then we are ready to close our doors and place over its portals and burning letters of fire, diluted and misguided by an array of biblical truths scientifically discussed. Just as an aside, there are no white people in the Bible. Let me say that again. There are no white people in the Bible. Jesus was not a white man. Adam was not white. So these are just a few of the stories. These are the big ones of the understanding of many in Christianity at that time, influential people who were saying that it is gospel truth that black people are less than human and that black people can be owned by white people. These are Christian people saying it. Now, in order to say that, they had to somehow justify that theology, right? And they developed a concept called race. Race is a fairly new concept. In the Bible, there's one race, human race. That's it. Everything else is ethnicities. And it used to be that we understood that. So in our country, for example, we had a lot of different ethnicities moving here. The Irish, the Italian, Japanese, Asian, whatever it might be. And then they, like in New York City, they would divide into their own neighborhoods. And so there were some bias issues, then around ethnicities. But we didn't have white and black then. It was ethnicities. Then race was created to justify the ownership of a certain kind of person. And for Christian people, they had to be able to justify the ownership of African Americans scripturally. So here's how it happened, all right? I showed you some stories of what the thinking was. Now here's some stories about how we got there. And then we'll wrap up for today, because this is pretty heavy-duty stuff. There are many people who believe that the concept of race first came into existence in 1415 in Portugal, of all places. There was a man by the name of Gomez Inez Zurara, and he wrote a biography of Prince Henry of Portugal. He bragged about how Portugal used African slaves. He was bragging about it. Now, slavery wasn't new. Other cultures have done that. And we know that in the Bible, that one nation would conquer another and they make slaves out of them. But this was a whole new deal. He was justifying the ownership of African people by enveloping it in missionary work. He said it was the job of Christians, white Christians, to evangelize the savages, to civilize the African savages. And so what we see is that race and racism was birthed out of really bad theology. A bad theology that wormed its way into American theology, and I'll make some disqualifiers when I'm done here. And I'll show you next week, it's still there in a different form. So he was really kind of the first to write about owning African slaves and justified it as an act of missionary work. And part of it to do that is he had to make sure that we understood that African people were less than human. That's why they could be owned. There was a travel writer, Christian man, quite influential. His name was George Best. He used the Bible to justify slavery and racism. And his story was from the Old Testament story of Noah. And essentially, here was his story. He says, Noah told his white sons, remember what I just said a few moments ago? There are no white people in the Bible. Anyway, this guy said, Noah told his white sons that they could not have sex with their wives while they were on the ark. But Ham, who was hypersexualized. Now, for those of you who know anything about race and some of the stereotypes about African Americans, that's one of them. That's a stereotype. Ham, who was hypersexualized, couldn't contain himself. He had sex with his wife. And God cursed him because of it, for having sex with his wife on the ark. And the sign of his curse was that he was black. And black people, Ham was subservient to his brothers. Black people are now subservient to white people because of the sin of Ham. And so over and over again, what we see, and I'm just giving you a bird's eye view, is this use of the Bible, misuse of the Bible theology to justify racism, to justify the dehumanizing of a people group, in this case, Africans. Robert Jones writes this: a dizzying array of resources across multiple fields of human inquiry has been deployed to defend the idea of supremacy of whites over other ethnic groups. By far, the strongest were theological arguments that presented white supremacy as a divine mandate. Particular readings of the Bible provided the scaffolding for these arguments. Blacks, for example, were cast as descendants of Cain, whom the Bible or the book of Genesis described as being physically marked by God after killing his brother Abel and then lying to God about the crime. In this narrative, the original black ancestor was a criminal, and modern-day dark-skinned people continue to bear the mark of this transgression. So what he's saying is, and this is one of the stories that I heard when I was a kid, nobody really believed it, I just remember hearing it, was that when Cain killed his brother Abel and then didn't fess up to it, he was cursed by God, and the curse was that his skin was turned black and he would now be subservient to white people. It's not in the Bible. There are no white people in the Bible. Cain was not a black man. It's just crap, right? Used to justify. So what was happening was we enslaved African people and then we needed a reason to do it. And so people turned to Scripture and created all kinds of nonsense. And this is why we're calling this a thinking person's guide to faith, because we still do it today. All right? So we looked at how some people said that Ham had sex with his wife on the ark, and therefore his skin was turned black, subservient. How Cain killed his brother, his curse was being a black person. Now it's to serve white people. There was another story about Ham. After the ark landed, his dad Noah got drunk. Ham walked in, saw him drunk and naked, and for some reason Noah curses him, and the curse is that he will be subservient to his brothers and he will be black. All right, so it's another version of the Ham story. Again, Ham was not black, no white people in the Bible. There are some people who said that the blacks were descendant from a different Adam, a black Adam. And then let me close with this, and then I'll have a couple wrap-up comments for you, because this is heavy stuff, I know. There was a slave Bible created, and we actually have 3 copies of this still in existence. All right, so we know what it is. And the title, this was a Bible for slaves. The title page reads, Parts of the Holy Bible, selected for the use of the Negro slaves in the British West India Islands. So this was a Bible that missionaries created to civilize and Christianize slaves, but they only gave them parts of it. And the parts that they highlighted were the verses that said slaves should be obedient to their masters. And the parts that they took out were anything to do with liberation. So the book of Exodus, which is the story of Israelite slaves being set free from slavery, gone. Not in the Bible at all. To try to take this really bad theology and then not only justify slavery, but then to get the slaves to buy into it as well. So what all of this does, and of course there's a whole lot more, right? I'm just doing that bird's eye view. This theology that justified racism left a genetic imprint on Christianity. Certain forms of Christianity, a white version of Christianity. It left a genetic imprint. It is still there to this day. So let me give a couple disclaimers, then I'll give you a little assignment. Again, not all white Christians bought into this theology. There were a number of white Christians and even denominations that fought against this abuse of Scripture. But the reason why I'm talking about this particular form of Christianity is because this is the form of Christianity that began to embed itself into the wider culture. It's sort of the populist view of Christianity. And many of us are still impacted. It doesn't matter if we go to a Catholic church or an Episcopalian church or a Lutheran church like ours or a Baptist church. This sort of populist view of Christianity is everywhere. And there are still vestiges of this view that whites are superior to blacks and blacks are inferior to whites. And so the takeaway is that racism is a gospel problem. It's embedded, it's in the genetic code of much of the white Christianity that we hear. And we need to be aware of it. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about next week. What are the little things that we can see where it's not overt racism, but it might be kind of subtle, right? Or it might give us permission to not have to deal with racism, if nothing else. It's still there around the edges. And that's why we're still in the mess we're in. So that's kind of an overview. And again, my whole point is just to start to open us up to be thinking. Right? I'm not here to give great pronouncements other than to say that was a misuse of the Bible. We still see a lot of that today on a lot of different subjects. And we as Christian people need to be wise and look at grace and truth together. So here's the assignment, something that I want you to think about. And this is going to be really tough, right? I know this one's going to be tough. Next week's assignment will be a little different. It's easy for us now to look back on that understanding of the gospel, which is, 150 years old, and say, how could they do that? How could they believe that? But if you lived 150 years ago, and Pastor Tim was talking to you and preaching to you, and told you the story of Ham, and said that Ham was this white guy who broke the law and had sex with his wife on the ark when he shouldn't, and God turned him black, and so now he's got to serve us. 150 years ago, what would you have done with that? And so the question today is, what do you do with it now? There are still vestiges of Christianity that want to tell us that there are certain people who are more important than other people. What do we do with that? How do we know? How do we learn? How do we expand our minds? One of the things that has been discouraging for me as a Christian pastor is the way that a number of white people just shut down any conversation about racism. They don't want to talk about it for a variety of reasons. And doesn't that just perpetuate the problem? So how do we think about this issue? That's the question. How do we think about it? How do we get to the truth? How do we get past our emotional reactions and get up front here where Jesus wants to speak to us and say, when you dehumanize others, you dehumanize yourself. I've called you to love your neighbor as I love them. And every human being is created in the image of God. So that's kind of your nebulous assignment, just to be thinking about it. How do you know? How do you get to the truth? How do you figure it out? Where would you have been 150 years from now? Where are you now? When Tim is talking about racism right now, what is your visceral response? What are you thinking? What does your heart say? And then we'll get at it again next week, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening now, right? And just some things that we can do to be thinking about this. So I really appreciate those of you who have watched. This is not necessarily easy stuff, but this is really important stuff. If we're going to be the church together, we're the church together through all of this kind of stuff. And so next week we'll do part 2. And a reminder to you that tomorrow night, Tony and Lisa will do some music. Friday night, Pastor Kathleen and her family do Faith 5. And then Saturday, we're going to look at Simon of Cyrene. And it's sort of the end of Black History Month for our worship services, but we'll do some more stuff the next couple of weeks. And it's going to be an inspiring message because Simon of Cyrene is a model for us of what the Christian life looks like. And looking forward to you being a part of that with us this weekend. I'm also going to tip you off. You'll see this in the email tomorrow, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a head start. This weekend in the worship services, I feel like I'm never looking at you. I'm always looking off the side. Sorry. This weekend for the worship services, we have 2 big, you don't want to miss announcements. 2 big, you don't want to miss announcements. That's all I'm going to tell you. You got to watch the worship service. Hey, if this was helpful for you and you think it'd be helpful for friends, share it when we're done. If it wasn't helpful for you, share it because your friends might find it that way. Again, if you have some questions for me, you can write them in the comments or just email me, tim@boldrecklessgrace.org, tim@boldrecklessgrace.org. And we'll try to deal with those questions as we go along in the next few weeks. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night. God's best to you.